Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hope you're doing well. We're continuing our deep dive into this pretty gnarly text, which is about the sexual revolution, okay? And she has really, I'd say, laid out their perspective quite plainly for us. Although some of her stuff she writes is a bit on the nose, I'd argue. We're going to continue upon that path. And let's begin. Bismillah. Just looking quickly over my annotations. Okay. It is easier to cope with the idea of sick men than it is to face the reality of a sick society. We've waited far too long to deal with our symptoms because we didn't want to hear the diagnosis. The prognosis is good, but the treatment is brutal. The people finally facing the consequences of having treated women and girls like faceless pieces of property may well be extremely unhappy about it. Faceless pieces of property, she contends. Now, I have seen some videos and clips, right, with how some men talk about women, and it is quite alarming, you know, but the good thing is you can sift through that pretty well, but I understand how they want to battle against those types of men who probably are better off not having a wife due to how they will mistreat her. Because they see her as property instead of a living, breathing human being. May well be extremely unhappy about it. That's understandable. I'm sure it's not a lot of fun to be Harvey Weinstein right now. But sadly for the disgraced super producer and those like him, the world is changing, and for once, no longer cassetting the feelings of powerful men. Okay, so she kind of goes on a rant and tangent there. Her next chapter is titled Bad Intimacy. We'll just use the word intimacy, even though she uses the X word. Pain is political, and so is pleasure. The greatest delusion of modern sexuality is that one has to come at the cost of the other. At the price of a straight man's pleasure, in particular in women's pain. Okay, that's why. What does she mean by that? Why is it that men's pleasure equals women's pain? Time and time again, when women and young people speak out against sexual violence, society reacts as if sex rather than violence were the problem to be solved. Here's an example of where that can lead. Well, you have to talk about the intimacy because it's happening in intimacy. Because it's the violence aspect. Violence is constantly talked about, right? People try to work on it. But at the same time, you have to recognize that intimacy is a part of it. And you have to tell people to stop being around people who you can't trust. And don't trust everybody. You have to be smart. Because some people have really bad intentions. It's a different kind of violence, right? In recent years, the notion of rough sex has become a popular defense strategy in assault and murder cases. Men who strangle or brutalize their partners routinely attempt to recast their behavior as simply rough sex gone wrong. Now, this is a very fascinating phenomenon because I have heard men say on these podcasts that women are asking them to be choked. But she uses the word strangle. Strangle that's different because you're purposely trying to suffocate the individual. Whereas all these BDSM dominatrix ladies have safe words and they promote choking. So it isn't just men asking for it, it's women accepting it and doing it for money and promoting it and trying to call it a kink and then saying you're not allowed to kink shame. So she puts men's feet to the fire, but she's really letting women off quite easily, when in reality, when I hear in all these degenerate red pill podcasts, those nasty females are constantly pushing it, and the men are the ones kind of pushing back, saying don't do it, don't catch a case, but the women are like, you have to please her. As if murder and maiming were everyday risks that any woman getting into bed with a man in the early 21st century should have weighed beforehand. I would say, yeah, you're putting yourself in a vulnerable situation. You always need to weigh the pros and cons. Am I going to buy this car? What kind of car is it? What kind of gas mileage does it got? How many miles does it have? I'm going to buy this lamp. What kind of voltage does it use? Is it going to tip over really easy? Do I like where it's going to be placed because of its size? You weigh the pros and cons of everything beforehand, as much as you can. Not overthink, but you contemplate disaster, what could strike. And if you're using these dating apps, and you're just meeting up with randos who could be catfishing people, or just doing human trafficking, or wanting to finally live out their fetish, you're going to be in some serious trouble. Today, violence is assumed to be foundational to straight sex. What I hate about this is she's ignoring how lesbians have high rates of domestic violence. Okay? She's really ignoring how humans inherently are prone to violence. Okay? It's not just heterosexuals. Lesbians are beating the snot out of each other in a way that has little to do with kink and nothing to do with consent. Cruelty and coercion are increasingly normal part of straight sexuality. So here we see what she's constantly trying to do. Shame the heterosexuals who keep the human race going, who are the majority, and ignore the rainbow mafias prone to violence as well. Violence against themselves, against others. Violence doesn't just come from one sexuality. It comes just from the humanness of our minds, right? We do that. Earth is a violent place. The weather is violent. The ocean is like a violent abode. You can't really escape. Even bugs are violent. More than a third of the UK women under the age of 40 have experienced unwanted slapping, choking, gagging, or spitting during consensual sex. Unwanted? Okay, unwanted. A lot of women produce that content for money. They get rich, they go on podcasts, they push it as normal. Okay? It's pushed all over social media, and if you're a conservative religious person and you say that shouldn't be promoted, then suddenly the sexual liberal feminists, they call you a prude, say, you don't have a right to tell us what to do with our bodies. But I do know that there's a split in the feminist movement. Those who are against adult content and those who are for it. So I do recognize how the radfems, some of them really are against adult entertainment. And I think that's part of what made them actually resent men so much. According to a BBC research unit, what does it do to your sexuality when you can't know if getting into bed with a perfectly nice-seeming stranger will involve being humiliated or hurt without asking? It gets worse. One study published in JAMA, Internal Medicine, which surveyed women aged 18 to 44, in the U.S. revealed that more than 3 million women experienced R-word as their first sexual encounter. Because that word has been so overused, we have to see what constituted the boundaries of it. We have to really see what that is, sadly. Because some women, they'll change the definition to fit their political needs, which leaves real victims aside. Like, they'll get drunk, they'll be doing stuff with the guy, and then they want to save face and say, like, oh, he did it without my consent, even though I took all my clothes off. But afterwards I felt bad and guilty, and now I revoked my consent during it, but he ignored me, and you're like, this is getting kind of weird. It's just a very dangerous time for That usually doesn't happen, though, when women are sober. It's always when the alcohol comes in, you have to wonder, how much do you remember? What's happening? Was he drunk? Two drunk minds or two minds on drugs coming together is not good. Be sober. Because it leads to so much mess. You know, it's really sad if those women had that experience. Despite all this, the simple idea that women's sexual agency matters and that the world should contain less R-words, it's still considered equivalent to hating sex. I wonder who says that, but you never know. The incel men, they can kind of go pretty far. They can. Campaigners against sexual violence are routinely treated as if they were attacking sexuality itself. This only makes sense if you accept a definition of straight sex, where men's pleasure is all that matters, where women are not allowed to set boundaries, and where humiliation, violence, and ritual misogyny are part of the lexicon of intimacy. Okay, so that's a lot to unpack right there. Okay. Ritual misogyny. Lexicon of intimacy. Humiliation? A lot of women contribute to that as well. So what's interesting is one woman will push the boundaries of what a man is used to. When they separate, he gets a woman who's more pure, who doesn't want that, and then he pushes the boundaries with the new girl, who may find something very humiliating. But there are men who do enjoy humiliating, and women who enjoy to be humiliated. It's a really nasty, vile world that tries to get romanticized by the very liberal degenerates. But I'd say you are always allowed to set boundaries. She contends here that women are not. And maybe there really are men who think like, oh, you're just something I get to use. That's why you need to make sure, as a mom, you have a good relationship with your daughters, and you use the law against bad men. Restraining orders, whatever you could do, help with divorce, like, make his life miserable if he violates your daughter in a certain way, and make sure to reprimand your sons as best as you can, if they do that to their wives. You have to be very careful. You are always able to set boundaries. Always, no matter what. It seems that for straight women, good intimacy still means intimacy where you weren't seriously injured or killed. Whoa, that's pretty loaded. I mean, wow. Hello. That's setting the bar super low. So good intimacy means where you weren't seriously injured or killed. So if you were lightly injured or almost killed, it still counts as good. I don't agree with that. But a lot of women who do drugs, they are not shy. They don't have as much care for what happens to them, so they'll allow certain things to happen to them so they can get drug money. That's a thing to talk about. But then you have lots of people, lots of liberals and atheists pushing for all drugs to be legalized, which would actually increase men doing things that they might not have done if they were not under the influence, and women accepting things that they might not have if they were not under the influence. Alhamdulillah for Islam, because we're not supposed to have intoxicants that don't get us into that kind of trouble. For straight men, by contrast, good intimacy is usually expected to involve the finish line, we'll put it that way. This discrepancy does not lead to erotic liberation. Okay, now we have another term. Erotic liberation. Okay, you gotta notice with the feminists that they invent like almost new militaristic political terms. Liberation. This sounds like you're liberating yourself from an occupying force, right? Erotic liberation. If you're talking to a woman and she was like, I have erotic liberation. I must finish and not just you. it's kind of like mood killer. Like, why are you approaching something so simple with such a librarian dictionary way? Intimacy can't seriously be considered free when it involves more than one person and only one of them enjoys it. Hold up. Now, this is a huge conversation which I can't get into because we need to maintain haya, we have shyness, right? It is extremely common that women don't get to have that finish line experience because the men don't last that long and they're not interested and they don't know how. Okay? That's true, but that doesn't mean you don't enjoy the ride, even if you don't get to cross the goal line. We'll put it that way. And men's finishes are faster and easier than a woman's. So, that's where you have to have communication. Or just accept that it's just not going to happen. Sounds kind of weird to say that. But when you get married, you got years with somebody till death, right? Expecting that you're going to get to the goal line every single time like the man, it's just not going to work. But that doesn't mean you don't enjoy the ride. You can still feel tired from it without having the goal line reached. What all of this means is that a lot of intimacy that is technically consensual is nonetheless dire and disappointing. What does she mean by technically consensual? No, it's not technically consensual. It is. When you say technically, you're making it sound like, well, I mean, it's technically. It's like a legalistic lawyer type of loophole. It is. Once you say yes, and you didn't say stop, it's consensual, hands down. And it may be dire just because you didn't get to have your little finish line, but it can be disappointing, that's true, but that's kind of life. And I would argue that just because the man goes to the end goal, I bet you there were things he wished he could have had, or maybe he wishes you were thinner. Don't be so harsh on the men. Just because they finished, I'm pretty sure there's things they wish that could have enhanced it. Right? So I think men and women are opposite in that. Like, women can clock out in their mind and pretend you're somebody else. The man probably can do that too. Just because he gets to the finish line doesn't mean that it was, like, not disappointing. There's much that could be said, but we can't say because it's not my place. Particularly straight intimacy, particularly for women. It's weird. She says she's queer, but she spends a lot of time shaming heterosexual relationships. Right? It almost sounds better. It's pretty creepy in a way. She really is trying to push the needle. I mean, in a book that talks about the sexual revolution, to me, thus far in this book, it sounds a lot like she really is pushing promiscuity, high body counts, which is kind of a ghetto term, I know, but I don't know another synonym for it. But she seems to really be not having a woman's best interest at heart. I would like to see this author talk to somebody who is maybe like Matt Walsh or Daniel Hakikichu, and so that they can have like a discussion on what men actually want to wife up versus what they just use and play with. Okay? And what's going to be for the benefit of the woman in the end. Right? Because there's always going to be trade-offs. There's always going to be trade-offs in life. You can't expect dream like intimacy. Like, you get married in your 20s. Let's say you die when you're 80. That's a lot of years with a lot of moments with your partner. You're not always gonna be like, this is the best ever every single time. It's just not something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us women, which sounds kind of sad, but it's really just the raw truth. So you must make best of what you have. You know? That's what I'd say. But, it's really raunchy. It's hard to read her stuff when she goes deep, because it's hard on the ears. But if you're talking to one of them in person, I mean, they're gonna bring that up, and you gotta get used to it. Their world perspective, you know. I really wish you would have explained what the heck is ritual misogyny. It's like ritualistic in terms of it's part of becoming a man to be misogynistic. And I would like to know what her definition of misogyny is, because everything seems to be labeled as racist, misogynistic, and fascist. And this really blurs the definition of it to the point where the woke dictionary start changing the term over time, you know, which can get pretty sticky. Let me know what you think. It's kind of a gnarly section, this one. But, don't marry someone like that. That's all I want to say. By the way, if you'd like to join my blog and support the channel, it's www.subscribestar.com/MilahanArchive. Hope to see you there.